My son's teacher called during a board meeting saying, "Your wife told him his medication makes him weak, and she's been throwing it away." The call came through at 10:37 a.m., while I was presenting quarterly revenue projections to 8 executives at Meridian Technologies. My phone was on silent, but I saw Mrs. Eleanor Kepler's name flash across the screen 3 times in rapid succession. She was my son Ethan's 3rd-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, and she'd never called during school hours before. I excused myself from the conference room and answered in the hallway, already knowing something was catastrophically wrong. "Mr. Dalton, I'm sorry to interrupt your workday, but I need you to come to the school immediately." Ethan collapsed during recess, and when the nurse checked his medical file, she discovered he hasn't received his seizure medication in over 2 weeks. When I asked Ethan about it, he said your wife told him the pills make him weak and that real men don't need medicine. He said she's been throwing them away every morning after you leave for work. My vision tunneled, and I grabbed the wall for support. Ethan had epilepsy, diagnosed at age 5 after his first grand mal seizure. His neurologist had been clear that missing even a single dose could trigger seizures, and going 2 weeks without medication was life-threatening. I told Mrs. Kepler I was leaving immediately and would be there in 15 minutes. I didn't go back into the conference room to explain or gather my materials. I just walked straight to the elevator and drove to the school faster than I should have, running 2 red lights and not caring if I got pulled over. My wife Vanessa had married me 8 months ago, after a year of dating that had seemed perfect in every way. She'd been attentive to Ethan, always asking about his medical needs and offering to handle his medication schedule since I traveled frequently for work. I'd thought I was lucky to find someone who embraced being a stepmother to a child with special medical needs. Now I realized I'd handed my son's life to someone who was actively trying to harm him. When I arrived at Riverside Elementary, the receptionist immediately directed me to the nurse's office where Ethan was lying on a cot with an ice pack on his forehead. He looked pale and smaller than his 8 years, his brown hair matted with sweat. Mrs. Kepler stood near the door with the school nurse, a woman in her 50s named Judith Brenner, who I'd met during Ethan's enrollment. Nurse Brenner explained that Ethan had fallen during recess and hit his head on the playground equipment. When she'd examined him, she'd noticed his eyes were dilated and his pupils weren't responding correctly to light, classic signs of seizure activity. She'd checked his medication log and discovered the last documented dose was from over 2 weeks ago, even though the school required daily confirmation that he'd taken his morning pill. I asked why no one had. Noticed he'd been missing medication for 2 weeks, and Brenner's face tightened with what looked like both guilt and anger. She explained that the school relied on parent confirmation, and someone had been signing the daily medication log saying Ethan had taken his pills. The signature wasn't mine, which meant Vanessa had been forging my name on the school forms while simultaneously withholding Ethan's medication. Mrs. Kepler pulled me aside and spoke quietly so Ethan wouldn't hear. She said this wasn't the first concerning thing she'd noticed. Over the past month, Ethan had become increasingly withdrawn during class, often falling asleep at his desk and struggling to concentrate. His grades had dropped from A's and B's to C's and D's. When she'd asked if everything was okay at home, Ethan had said his new mom made him exercise a lot and didn't let him be lazy. I knelt beside Ethan's cot and touched his shoulder gently. He opened his eyes and immediately started crying, saying he was sorry for being weak and that he'd tried to be stronger without the pills. The words felt rehearsed, and I realized Vanessa had been conditioning him to believe his medical condition was a character flaw rather than a neurological disorder he couldn't control. I told Ethan he wasn't weak, that his medicine was important and kept him safe, and that no one should have told him otherwise. He grabbed my hand and whispered that Vanessa said the pills were for babies, and that if he really loved her, he'd prove he was tough enough to go without them. The manipulation was sophisticated and cruel, targeting an 8-year-old's desire to please his new stepmother and framing life-saving medication as a test of loyalty. Nurse Brenner said she'd already called Ethan's neurologist, Dr. Raymond Foster, and explained the situation. Dr. Foster wanted Ethan brought to the hospital immediately for evaluation and to restart his medication under medical supervision. Going 2 weeks without anticonvulsants could cause breakthrough seizures, and the fall during recess suggested he'd already had at least one episode. I carried Ethan to my car and drove to Children's Memorial Hospital, where Dr. Foster's office was located. During the drive, Ethan kept apologizing and asking if I was mad at him. I explained that I wasn't angry with him at all, that he'd done nothing wrong, and that the adults in his life had failed to protect him. I told him that his medication wasn't something to be ashamed of, that millions of people took medicine for different conditions, and that taking care of our health was brave, not weak. He seemed to relax slightly, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. Vanessa had spent weeks undermining everything his doctors and I had taught him about managing his epilepsy, and reversing that psychological damage would take time. At the hospital, Dr. Foster examined Ethan thoroughly, checking his reflexes, pupil response, and cognitive function. He ordered an EEG to measure Ethan's brain activity and determine if he'd had any seizures beyond the one that caused his fall at school. While Ethan was being prepared for the EEG, Dr. Foster pulled me into his office and closed the door. His expression was grave as he explained that withholding anticonvulsant medication from a child with epilepsy constituted medical neglect and potentially reckless endangerment. Dr. Foster said he was legally obligated to report this to Child Protective Services because Ethan's health had been deliberately compromised by someone with caretaker authority. I told him to make the report immediately, that I wanted every possible agency investigating what Vanessa had done. He picked up his office phone and called CPS while I sat there, and I listened as he gave a detailed medical explanation of Ethan's condition, the dangers of medication withdrawal, and the evidence that his stepmother had been systematically preventing him from receiving prescribed treatment. The caseworker on the other end apparently asked several questions because Dr. Foster spent 15 minutes providing additional context about seizure disorders, medication protocols, and the timeline of Ethan's missed doses. When he hung up, he told me a caseworker named Stephanie Ruiz would be coming to the hospital within the hour to interview both Ethan and me. He also said that legally, Vanessa should not have unsupervised access to Ethan until the investigation was complete. I called my attorney, Philip Carson, from the hospital waiting room. Philip had handled my divorce from Ethan's mother 3 years ago and had drafted the prenuptial agreement when Vanessa and I got married. I explained everything in one rushed explanation, and Philip was silent for several long seconds before responding. He said withholding prescribed medication from a child was a serious crime that could result in criminal charges including child endangerment, reckless conduct, and potentially assault if prosecutors could prove intent to harm. He asked if I had any documentation of Vanessa's actions beyond Ethan's statement and the forged medication logs at school. I told him about Mrs. Kepler's observations of Ethan's declining behavior and health, and about Dr. Foster's medical findings. Philip said that was a strong foundation, but that we needed more evidence to build an airtight case. He recommended I go home after the hospital visit and search for the missing medication. If Vanessa had been throwing away Ethan's pills, there might be physical evidence in the house. He also told me to check our home security cameras if we had any, and to document everything I found with photos and videos. I told him we had cameras at the front door and in the kitchen, because Vanessa had insisted on installing them for security purposes. Philip said to download all footage from the past 2 weeks immediately before Vanessa had a chance to delete it. The EEG results showed abnormal brain activity consistent with recent seizure activity, confirming that Ethan had experienced at least one episode, possibly more, during the 2 weeks without medication. Dr. Foster said Ethan was lucky the seizures hadn't been more severe or resulted in serious injury beyond the playground fall. He administered a carefully calibrated dose of Ethan's anticonvulsant and explained we'd need to gradually return to his full prescribed dosage over the next few days to avoid shocking his system. He wanted Ethan to stay overnight in the hospital for observation to ensure he didn't have any additional seizures as the medication was reintroduced. I called my office and told my assistant I wouldn't be returning for the rest of the week, possibly longer. She asked if everything was okay, and I said there was a family emergency. The caseworker, Stephanie Ruiz, arrived at the hospital around 2:30 p.m. She was in her 40s with a professional demeanor that balanced warmth and seriousness. She interviewed Ethan first while I waited outside the room, and I could hear his small voice through the door, explaining what Vanessa had told him about the medication. When Stephanie emerged 30 minutes later, her expression was tight with controlled anger. She said Ethan's account was clear and consistent, that he'd described a pattern of Vanessa telling him the pills were unnecessary, that taking them meant he was weak, and that if he wanted to be part of the family, he needed to prove he was strong enough to go without them. Ethan had also mentioned that Vanessa made him do extra exercises when he asked about his medication, things like running up and down the stairs 20 times or doing push-ups until his arms hurt. Stephanie characterized this as psychological manipulation combined with physical punishment, designed to reinforce the idea that Ethan's medical needs were shameful. She interviewed me next, asking detailed questions about my relationship with Vanessa, how long we'd been married, what our household dynamics were, and whether I'd noticed any changes in Ethan's behavior or health. I admitted that I'd been traveling for work frequently over the past 2 months and hadn't been as present as I should have been. I'd noticed Ethan seemed tired and quieter than usual, but Vanessa had explained it as normal adjustment to having a new parent in the house. I'd trusted her explanation because I'd wanted to believe our blended family was working. Stephanie asked if Vanessa had any history of concerning behavior toward Ethan before the medication incident. I thought back through the 8 months we'd been married and realized there had been small things I'd dismissed at the time. Vanessa had been critical of Ethan's eating habits, calling him picky and saying he needed to learn to eat what was served without complaining. She'd insisted on rigid bedtime routines that seemed harsh for an 8-year-old, including no water after 7 p.m. and lights out at exactly 8 p.m. with no exceptions. She'd also started making comments about Ethan needing to be tougher, less sensitive, more independent. At the time, I'd chalked it up to different parenting styles and had assumed she was trying to help Ethan develop resilience. Now I saw those incidents as part of a pattern of control and belittlement designed to undermine a vulnerable child. Stephanie took detailed notes and said she'd be opening a formal investigation. She explained that CPS would likely recommend I file for emergency custody modifications to ensure Vanessa had no legal authority over Ethan's care and that I should consider seeking a restraining order to prevent her from having any contact with him until the investigation concluded. After Stephanie left, I sat with Ethan in his hospital room while he dozed under the effects of the anticonvulsant and the exhaustion from his ordeal. I watched his small chest rise and fall with each breath and felt a crushing weight of guilt that I'd failed to protect him. I'd been so focused on my career and on trying to make my second marriage work that I'd missed all the signs that my wife was harming my son. The realization that I'd been complicit through my absence and trust was almost unbearable. Around 6 p.m., my phone started buzzing with calls from Vanessa. She'd apparently heard about the school incident and was demanding to know where Ethan was and why I hadn't informed her immediately. I didn't answer the first 3 calls, but on the 4th, I picked up and told her I knew what she'd been doing. There was a brief silence before she launched into a defensive explanation about how she'd only been trying to help Ethan build character, that modern medicine over-medicated children, and that she'd read articles about natural approaches to managing epilepsy. Her justifications were a mix of pseudoscience and victim-blaming that made my hands shake with rage. I told her she'd endangered our son's life and that she was no longer welcome in our home. She laughed and said the house was legally hers too, as my wife, and that I couldn't just kick her out based on a child's exaggerated complaints. I hung up without responding further and called Philip back to ask about the process for removing her from the house. He said I couldn't legally force her to leave without a court order, but he could file for an emergency protective order first thing in the morning that would require her to vacate the premises. In the meantime, he recommended I stay at the hospital with Ethan and not return home until the protective order was in place. I spent the night in a chair beside Ethan's hospital bed, dozing fitfully and waking every time a nurse came in to check his vitals. Around 3 a.m., Ethan woke up crying from a nightmare about Vanessa yelling at him for being weak. I held his hand and reassured him that he was safe, that Vanessa couldn't hurt him anymore, and that I would make sure he always had his medication. He asked if Vanessa hated him, and I had to find words to explain that some adults have problems that make them hurt people, but that it was never the child's fault. Philip filed the emergency protective order at 8 a.m. when the courthouse opened. By 11 a.m., we had a hearing scheduled in front of Judge Angela Whitmore, who handled family court cases in our jurisdiction. Philip explained that emergency hearings typically involved presenting evidence to justify immediate action, and that the standard was whether there was credible evidence of imminent harm to a child. We had Dr. Foster's medical documentation, the school's records of forged medication logs, Ethan's testimony to the CPS caseworker, and the EEG results showing recent seizure activity. Philip said it was one of the strongest cases for emergency intervention he'd seen. The hearing took place in a small courtroom with just the judge, a court reporter, Philip, myself, and a lawyer representing the court's interest in Ethan's welfare. Vanessa hadn't been notified of the hearing because emergency protective orders were designed to be issued quickly before the subject could interfere. Judge Whitmore reviewed the evidence Philip presented, including written statements from Dr. Foster and Mrs. Kepler, the CPS preliminary report from Stephanie Ruiz, and photos of the forged medication logs. Judge Whitmore's expression grew increasingly severe as she read through the materials. She asked me directly how long I'd been aware of the medication situation, and I explained that I'd only learned about it yesterday when Mrs. Kepler called. She asked why I hadn't been monitoring Ethan's medication myself, and I had to admit that I'd delegated that responsibility to Vanessa because of my work travel schedule. The judge's response was sharp, pointing out that entrusting a child's critical medical care to someone else didn't absolve me of responsibility for ensuring it was being handled properly. She granted the emergency protective order requiring Vanessa to vacate our home immediately and prohibiting her from any contact with Ethan pending a full hearing in 2 weeks. She also ordered me to ensure I had systems in place to personally verify Ethan's medication compliance going forward, making it clear that my parental responsibilities couldn't be outsourced. I left the courthouse with the protective order and drove back to the hospital where Ethan was being discharged. Dr. Foster provided detailed instructions for reintroducing Ethan's full medication dosage and scheduled follow-up appointments to monitor his recovery. I took Ethan to a hotel instead of going home because I didn't want him anywhere near Vanessa until the protective order had been served and she'd left the house. Philip arranged for a process server to deliver the order to Vanessa at our home that afternoon, with a police escort to ensure she left peacefully. While Ethan and I were having lunch in the hotel restaurant, my phone buzzed with a text from our neighbor, an older man named, Gerald, who lived 2 houses down. The text said police cars were at my house and asked if everything was okay. I replied that there was a situation being handled and thanked him for letting me know. 20 minutes later, Philip called to confirm that Vanessa had been served with the protective order and had left the house under police supervision. She'd taken some personal belongings, but had been prevented from removing anything else pending property division proceedings. The police had changed our locks, and I now had the only keys. Philip said I could return home safely, but recommended I document the condition of the house in case Vanessa had damaged anything before leaving. When Ethan and I got home around 4 p.m., the house looked relatively normal at first glance, but as I walked through each room, I noticed subtle changes that revealed Vanessa's anger. Photos of Ethan that had been displayed on shelves were now face down or missing entirely. His artwork from school that had been on the refrigerator was gone. In his bedroom, some of his favorite toys had been removed or broken, including a Lego set he'd spent weeks building. The destruction was petty and vindictive, targeting a child's belongings to punish him for exposing her abuse. I took photos of everything for documentation, and then helped Ethan assess what was missing or damaged. He seemed more confused than upset, asking why Vanessa would break his things if she was supposed to love him. I didn't have a good answer beyond explaining that sometimes people who hurt others also try to hurt them in different ways when they're caught. I promised we'd replace everything and that his room would be his safe space again. That evening, I logged into our home security camera system and downloaded footage from the past 3 weeks. The cameras had been Vanessa's idea, ostensibly for security, but now I suspected she'd wanted them to monitor Ethan's behavior and ensure he wasn't telling me about her actions. I spent 3 hours reviewing footage and found exactly what I'd feared. Multiple videos showed Vanessa taking Ethan's medication bottle from the kitchen cabinet each morning, removing a pill and dropping it down the garbage disposal. The footage was dated and time-stamped, providing irrefutable evidence of deliberate medication withholding. I also found videos of Vanessa making Ethan do exercises as punishment for asking about his medication, forcing him to run stairs or do push-ups while she stood over him yelling that he needed to be tougher. In one particularly disturbing clip, Ethan was crying and saying he felt dizzy, and Vanessa responded by telling him that weakness was a choice, and he needed to decide if he wanted to be part of this family or be sent away. The threat of abandonment to control a child who'd already lost his biological mother through divorce was psychological abuse layered on top of medical neglect. I copied all the footage to multiple drives and sent copies to Philip, to CPS caseworker Stephanie Ruiz, and to my personal email account. Philip called after reviewing the videos and said they were damning evidence that would support not just the protective order, but potential criminal charges. He recommended I contact the district attorney's office to file a criminal complaint, explaining that while CPS handled child welfare investigations, criminal prosecution was separate and could proceed in parallel. The videos showed clear intent to harm, systematic deception through the forged medication logs, and psychological abuse through the punishment exercises. Philip said most prosecutors would view this as a strong case for endangering the welfare of a child, if not more serious charges. I contacted the district attorney's office the next morning and was connected with a prosecutor named Lisa Thornton, who handled crimes against children. I explained the situation and offered to provide all documentation and evidence. She scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon and told me to bring everything, including the security camera footage, medical records, and school documentation. During that meeting, Lisa reviewed everything methodically, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline. She was particularly interested in the security footage showing Vanessa disposing of the medication and forcing Ethan to exercise as punishment. She explained that the state took a dim view of adults who deliberately withheld prescribed medication from children, especially medication that prevented life-threatening seizures. She said she'd be filing charges of reckless endangerment of a child and possibly assault if the evidence supported proving Vanessa had intended to cause physical harm. The challenge with assault charges was demonstrating intent, but the systematic nature of the medication withholding and the psychological manipulation around it suggested this wasn't negligence, but deliberate action designed to harm or control. Lisa said she'd present the case to a grand jury within 2 weeks to seek an indictment. In the meantime, she recommended I cooperate fully with the CPS investigation and maintain detailed documentation of Ethan's medical recovery and any behavioral changes. Over the next week, Ethan and I established new routines that centered his health and emotional well-being. I took a leave of absence from work to be present full-time, something I should have done months ago. Every morning, I personally administered Ethan's medication and documented it with photos showing him taking the pill and the date and time. I enrolled him in therapy with a child psychologist named Dr. Monica Reeves, who specialized in trauma recovery. During our first session, Dr. Reeves explained that children who experienced medical neglect often developed anxiety around their health and treatment, fearing that advocating for their needs would result in punishment or abandonment. Ethan would need time and consistent reassurance to rebuild trust that his medical needs would be met and that adults would protect him. The full protective order hearing took place 2 weeks after the emergency order had been issued. This time, Vanessa was present with her attorney, a man named Douglas Finch, who specialized in family law. Finch attempted to portray Vanessa's actions as misguided concern rather than malicious abuse, arguing that she'd been following alternative health advice and hadn't understood the severity of Ethan's condition. Judge Whitmore shut down that argument immediately, noting that the security footage showed deliberate disposal of medication, systematic deception through forged logs, and psychological punishment when Ethan asked for his pills. Those actions demonstrated knowledge that what she was doing was wrong and needed to be hidden. The judge extended the protective order for 6 months and expanded it to prohibit Vanessa from contacting me, Ethan, or anyone at his school. She also ordered supervised visitation only if Vanessa completed parenting classes and psychological evaluation, though she noted that given the severity of the medical neglect, she was skeptical visitation would be appropriate even with supervision. Finch tried to argue that Vanessa had rights as a step-parent, but Judge Whitmore pointed out that step-parents who endangered their stepchildren forfeited those rights. The criminal case moved forward simultaneously. The grand jury indicted Vanessa on charges of reckless endangerment of a child and child abuse. She was arrested and released on $50,000 bail with conditions that included staying away from Ethan in our home and submitting to GPS monitoring. The arrest made local news because cases of step-parents withholding medication from stepchildren were relatively rare and particularly egregious. Several news outlets requested interviews, but Philip advised me to decline and let the legal process proceed without media involvement that could complicate the proceedings. Vanessa's attorney filed motions to suppress the security camera footage, arguing it had been obtained without her knowledge and violated her privacy. The motion was denied because the cameras had been installed with her full knowledge and consent, and because footage from one's own home security system didn't require warrants when the homeowner was reviewing it. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later. In the meantime, I focused on Ethan's recovery. Dr. Foster monitored his medication levels and brain activity through regular EEGs and was pleased to report that Ethan's seizures were fully controlled again now that he was consistently receiving his anticonvulsant. The physical recovery was straightforward, but the psychological healing was more complex. Ethan had nightmares about Vanessa returning and taking away his medication. He developed anxiety around taking his pills, sometimes asking multiple times whether I was sure the medication was good and necessary. Dr. Reeves worked with him on rebuilding trust and understanding that his medical needs were valid and important. She also worked with me on recognizing that my guilt over the situation, while understandable, couldn't dominate my parenting. Ethan needed me to be confident and present, not drowning in self-recrimination. Mrs. Kepler checked in regularly to see how Ethan was doing. She mentioned that she'd felt terrible about not catching the forged medication logs sooner, but I explained that Vanessa had been sophisticated in her deception and that teachers couldn't be expected to verify every parent's signature. Mrs. Kepler said the school had since implemented a new protocol requiring medication documentation to be submitted electronically through a secure portal, preventing future forgeries. She also noted that Ethan's behavior in class had improved dramatically now that he was back on his medication. His concentration had returned, his grades were recovering, and he was participating in activities with friends again. The trial began on a cold morning in November, 4 months after Mrs. Kepler's initial phone call. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from television portrayals, with simple wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and clinical. Lisa Thornton opened with a straightforward presentation of the facts, walking the jury through Ethan's epilepsy diagnosis, his prescribed treatment protocol, and the medical necessity of consistent anticonvulsant medication. She explained that missing even a few doses could trigger seizures, and that going 2 weeks without medication was life-threatening. Then she presented the evidence of Vanessa's actions, the security footage showing her disposing of pills in the garbage disposal, the forged medication logs at school, Ethan's testimony to the CPS caseworker about being told the medicine made him weak, and the punishment exercises he'd been forced to perform. The jury watched the security videos in silence, and I saw several members shaking their heads or looking angry as Vanessa's face appeared on screen, dropping pills into the disposal day after day. Dr. Foster testified as an expert witness about epilepsy, the dangers of medication withdrawal, and the evidence that Ethan had experienced seizure activity during the period he'd been without his anticonvulsant. He explained that Ethan had been fortunate the seizures hadn't resulted in more serious injury or death, but that the risk had been substantial. Mrs. Kepler testified about the behavioral changes she'd observed in Ethan and about discovering the forged medication logs. Stephanie Ruiz from CPS testified about her investigation and about Ethan's statements describing Vanessa's manipulation and punishment. The prosecution rested after 3 days of testimony. Douglas Finch's defense strategy was to claim Vanessa had been acting on concern for Ethan's health based on research she'd done about alternative SU, epilepsy treatments, and the dangers of overmedication in children. He called an expert witness who testified about nutritional approaches to managing seizures and about controversies in pediatric medication protocols. Lisa Thornton demolished this defense on cross-examination by pointing out that Vanessa had never consulted with Ethan's actual neurologist about alternative treatments, had never discussed her concerns with me, and had hidden her actions through forgery and deception. If Vanessa had genuinely been concerned about Ethan's treatment, she had multiple legitimate avenues to raise those concerns. Instead, she'd unilaterally decided to withhold life-saving medication from a child in her care and had manipulated that child into believing his medical needs were shameful. Finch called Vanessa to testify in her own defense, which Philip later told me was a risky move that usually backfired. Vanessa presented herself as a concerned stepmother who'd been trying to help Ethan become more independent and resilient. She claimed she'd read research suggesting that some children were unnecessarily medicated and that she'd wanted to see if Ethan could manage his condition through diet and lifestyle changes. She characterized the punishment exercises as encouraging physical fitness and denied telling Ethan his medication made him weak. The security footage contradicted her denials completely. Lisa Thornton played the videos again during cross-examination, showing Vanessa disposing of medication and standing over Ethan as he cried while doing push-ups. She asked Vanessa to explain how those actions aligned with her claims of concern for his welfare. Vanessa struggled to answer, eventually falling back on claims that she'd been stressed and had made poor decisions, but hadn't intended to harm anyone. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both charges, reckless endangerment of a child and child abuse. Vanessa's face went white when the verdicts were read, and her mother, who'd been sitting in the gallery, started crying. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that hearing, I was allowed to provide a victim impact statement describing how Vanessa's actions had affected Ethan. I explained that my son had developed anxiety around his medication and feared that advocating for his medical needs would result in punishment or abandonment. I described the nightmares, the behavioral regression, and the psychological damage from being told his epilepsy was a weakness rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. I also acknowledged my own failures in protecting Ethan, noting that I'd been too focused on work and too trusting of Vanessa. Judge Whitmore listened carefully and then sentenced Vanessa to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. The sentence was at the higher end of the guidelines because of the deliberate nature of the abuse and the vulnerability of the victim. The judge noted that Vanessa had betrayed the trust placed in her as a step-parent and had endangered a child who depended on adults to protect his health and well-being. After Vanessa was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complicated mix of relief, sadness, and ongoing guilt. Relief that Ethan was safe and that Vanessa would be held accountable. Sadness that my attempt to build a new family had resulted in trauma for my son. Guilt that I hadn't protected him sooner and that my absence and trust had enabled the abuse. Philip filed for divorce on my behalf the day after sentencing, and given Vanessa's conviction, she didn't contest it. The divorce was finalized within 3 months. The prenuptial agreement meant she received nothing beyond her personal belongings. I sold the house because Ethan couldn't feel safe there after everything that had happened. We moved to a smaller home closer to his school and Dr. Reeves's office. I restructured my job to eliminate most travel and negotiated the ability to work from home 3 days a week. My career advancement slowed, but I'd learned the hard way that professional success meant nothing if I failed as a father. Ethan continued therapy with Dr. Reeves for over a year. Gradually, his nightmares decreased and his anxiety around medication diminished. He learned to advocate for his medical needs without fear of punishment, understanding that adults who cared about him would listen and support him. Mrs. Kepler remained his teacher through 4th grade and provided consistent support as he rebuilt his confidence. Dr. Foster continued monitoring his epilepsy, and Ethan remained seizure-free with proper medication management. 2 years after Mrs. Kepler's phone call, Ethan was thriving academically and socially. He'd made close friends, had rejoined activities he'd dropped during the period with Vanessa, and talked openly about his epilepsy without shame. He understood that he had a medical condition that required treatment, just as people with diabetes needed insulin or people with poor vision needed glasses. The medication wasn't a weakness, but a tool that helped him live fully and safely. I'd learned to prioritize presence over perfection, showing up for school events and medical appointments and ordinary evenings rather than chasing promotions and board meetings. The guilt never completely disappeared, but I channeled it into being the parent Ethan deserved rather than dwelling in regret. 3 years later, I stood beside Ethan at his middle school graduation. He was 12 now, confident and healthy, wearing his cap and gown and excited about starting junior high. As they called his name and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, I thought about the phone call that had changed everything. Mrs. Kepler's voice saying my wife had been throwing away his medication. The panic of realizing I'd failed to protect him. The determination to do better. Ethan looked at me from the stage and smiled. And in that moment, I understood that healing wasn't about erasing past mistakes, but about learning from them and building something better. We'd survived the betrayal and abuse. We'd rebuilt our lives with medical care, therapy, proper prioritization, and the stubborn refusal to let someone else's cruelty define our future. That was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.